Good, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here. So what I've tried to put together is something which is, I suppose, synoptic, but has a bit of substance to it, and some of the things that, many of the things perhaps that I'm going to say about psychoanalysis are controversial, and I won't be able to defend them adequately, and I expect people to take issue with them. So the structure of the talk is, I'm going to talk about the different receptions of Freud in, on the one hand, the analytic and then the so-called continental sphere, and then pursue the question of whether or not psychoanalysis has impact in the sense that Ricoeur claims that it does when he talks about the hermeneutics of suspicion. And then I think what, to my mind, is the more interesting part is try and say something about how one could reconstruct a kind of conceptual reconstruction of psychoanalysis. So, to begin then, this idea that we're concerned with, this idea that Freud unmasks or subverts, debunks, in some way exposes as false and illusory. This idea is highly familiar, circulates very widely, appears in many different forms. It seems to me it's hard to state, let alone engage with, without first being made a bit more precise, and quite a lot of what I've got to say is an attempt just to do that, with, as I said, a further attempt in the final part of the paper to say where I think psychoanalysis, as it were, makes its cut and how deep it goes. And perhaps I should say at this point, perhaps in some contrast with Michael Rosen yesterday, I'm going to try and give a favourable view up to a point of Freud's project. So what I'm concerned with is not, just to make this clear, not the truth of psychoanalysis, but rather what would follow from it, what kind of revisions to our pre-Freudian image of ourselves would be required if it were true. And this means that the familiar, much debated issue, people will know about, issues of psychoanalysis conformity or lack of it to the canons of either natural science or hermeneutics, all of that very familiar stuff. That has some relevance here, but limited relevance. If we're trying to work out what difference psychoanalysis makes to our ordinary self-understanding, our manifest self-image, in the famous phrase, then we certainly need to take some view of its conceptual or logical character, but we don't need to, I think, decide exactly how psychoanalysis compares with physics or literary criticism or relates to neuroscience. So the first question is, to lay it on the table, what is it exactly that psychoanalysis is supposed to attack? At what level does its challenge lie? And two possibilities suggest themselves. The one is that psychoanalysis attacks natural consciousness, what we ordinarily think. The other, that it attacks a philosophical standpoint, not necessarily the standpoint of any particular philosopher or school of philosophy, but at least a set of high-level assumptions of a kind that could be expressed in the form of philosophical doctrines. And here, I think worth noting that this is a very, very famous, I won't read it out, paragraph from the introductory lectures. This is the famous place where Freud describes psychoanalysis as administering a blow more wounding than those of either Copernicus or Darwin to the human self-image. And the point I just want to highlight is just that as Freud describes it, it is a blow to, as he puts it, man's naive self-love and to human megalomania. So perhaps the suggestion is that the target, he doesn't regard psychoanalysis as overturning our basic self-conception. Rather, he's concerned with it as contesting certain narcissistic extrapolations or interpretations of it. So this distinction I've just drawn of two different targets, the one natural consciousness, the other philosophical, obviously this is an artificial distinction insofar as if the commitments of natural consciousness that psychoanalysis contradicts are articulated, or to the extent that they're defended by some philosophical theory, then necessarily in attacking the one, psychoanalysis would also be attacking the other. So clearly they're linked. Nevertheless, I think it's helpful to consider the two cases separately. That is, to consider psychoanalysis as potentially having its impact through these two different routes, even if the ultimate critical upshot is the same, if only for the reason that this matches rather strikingly what we find in the philosophical literature. The distinction of targets follows, as I'll now try and show, a distinction of philosophical traditions. So in the English-speaking world, the bulk of philosophical attention to Freud hasn't really been very great, has been on the relation between psychoanalysis and ordinary, or what's sometimes often called prejudicially and condescendingly, I think, folk psychology. And we see this in the very first, not much read now, but of interest, I think, Anglophone body of philosophical literature on Freud, which emerged in the 60s and 70s, writers like names that may not mean much, Peter Alexander, R.S. Peters, Stephen Toulmin, Frank Cioffi, Anthony Flew, what's better known, Alistair MacIntyre, all of whom took up the question of psychoanalysis in the context of an agenda set by Wittgenstein. And the guiding notion was very roughly that psychoanalysis reposes in an interestingly acute form the puzzle that Wittgenstein's investigations had left us with concerning the nature of psychological ascription and explanation, meaning simply the way that we talk about ourselves and one another as persons. Wittgenstein's own doctrine, if anything so vulgar can be attributed to him, being that psychological explanation in the sense just given is non-causal and exhaustive, and this being obviously, in obvious ways, a problematic position. So in that context, philosophers, some took up the orthodox Wittgensteinian view, maintaining the hegemony and exclusiveness of reason explanation, looked at Freud, argued that Freud is confused because he mistakes what are really, if they are real, reasons. He mistakes them for causes. Others argued that Freud justifiably looks for causes where reasons can't be found. Others argued that Freud connects cause and meaning in a perhaps innovative or revealing way that shows something about the relation between the causal and hermeneutic components of psychological items. Also informing discussion in this period, and again owing something to Wittgenstein, was the perceived continuity between the puzzle of how to make sense of the sorts of things that Freud focuses on in his studies of individual psychology, so things like dreams, parapraxes, symptoms, neurotic symptoms, and so on, and the puzzle of how to make sense of things like myth, magic, symbolism, belief systems of traditional pre-modern societies. And in both cases, the problem is to understand how what seems on the face of it to violate all of the canons of rationality, beliefs which it seems impossible to believe, reasons for action which seem manifestly pointless, how can these things be, as it seems, avowed by what seem to be rational subjects? Well, whether there is some way in which psychoanalysis, when treated in this analytic perspective, in terms of the problem, the general issue of psychological explanation, whether there's some way in which it might emerge as revisionary or deeply revisionary, that's something I'll come back to later. But just from what I've said so far, I think you will have got the implication that a philosophically conservative estimate of Freud is the most likely result of this style of consideration of psychoanalysis. Now, turning to the other side of the channel, the issue I've just been referring to, whether or not psychoanalysis is concerned with either reasons or causes or both, this question receives a good deal of discussion in continental European philosophy in the 20th century. So, to run through a list, Jaspers, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty all engage with it, as do Habermas, Adorno in his Habilitation-Schrift, and Ricoeur in his book pays a great deal of attention to it. But I think it's fair to say that for none of these philosophers is the reasons causes issue the primary focus or of ultimate interest in the philosophical reflection on psychoanalysis. Much more important in their view is the supposed impact of psychoanalytic ideas on two very high-level, foundational, interconnected philosophical assumptions, which are both recognizably Kantian. First, that consciousness and self-consciousness are irreducible and fundamental to philosophical thought, and secondly, that individual human subjects possess a deep kind of autonomy, which again needs to be accorded a privileged position in philosophical reflection. In other words, psychoanalysis is thought of, to some extent, as competing at the same level as, and maybe controverting or threatening to do so, Descartes and Kant. And just to make this point clear, so here is a battery of quotations from essays by Ricard, published at roughly the same time as his book on psychoanalysis. Let me just read through them. Through this failure, the one exposed by psychoanalysis, consciousness discovers that its immediate self-certainty was mere presumption. Freudian realism brings the failure of reflective consciousness to its completion. Reflection and consciousness no longer, after Freud, coincide. Consciousness must be lost in order that the subject may be found. The subject is not what we think it is. The reading of Freud is also the crisis of the philosophy of the subject. It imposes the dispossession of the subject, such as it appears primarily to itself in the form of consciousness. It makes consciousness not a given but a task. The genuine cogito must be gained through the false cogitos that mask it. And so I say that Freud can be read just as our colleagues and teachers read Plato, Descartes, and Kant. There are no longer immediate givens of consciousness. The enigma of Freudian discourse becomes a paradox of reflection. Okay. Well, I should immediately say, so as not to misrepresent or do a disservice to Ricard, that I have isolated these heavily rhetorical, aphoristic statements from their context, and Ricard's treatment of Freud is nothing if not highly nuanced and sensitive to all issues, very, very fair-handed. I pick them out just because they highlight something which seems to me is quite distinctive of the continental reception of Freud, and similar statements could be found in later Lacan, Michel Henry, or going back in time to Sartre, who spends quite a bit of time on Freud and being a nothingness. Now, if an analytic philosopher of mind with an interest in Freud is asked to say what they think of statements like these, the response will be negative or skeptical. They may agree that there is something puzzling in the very notion of an unconscious mental state. How can we prize apart something's having content for a subject from its being presented to a subject? Searle has a very good paper on that. But they will not accept the suggestion, I think, that Freudian theory is itself ground-shaking philosophical news in the way that Ricard claims. And as evidence of this, I would just point to the fact that the two Anglophone philosophers whose writings about Freud have, I think, been most influential in the analytic world, Richard Wollheim and Jonathan Lear, they really set no store by this idea that psychoanalysis decenters, is a kind of decentering metaphysics of the subject. Wollheim and Lear certainly don't think that Freud leaves everything as it was before, but they don't regard Freud as achieving his impact in the directly philosophical manner envisaged by Ricard. So Wollheim maintains a fairly staunch realism about personal identity. Lear, I think, thinks that an Aristotelian substance model of persons can accommodate Freud's metapsychology. So in this view, Ricard has just mislocated Freud's originality and insights. And just to pursue this angle, which just to kind of work through it, philosophers in this Anglophone tradition, I think if they're historically minded, they can quite clearly point to the fact that the concept of the unconscious has a very long prehistory. This is a point often made, and go on to argue that since the idea of unconscious mentality as such goes back to Leibniz, Plotinus, if you like, it ought really not to have philosophical shock value. And if a philosopher is unsettled by Freud's hypothesis concerning the unconscious, then that can only be because the philosopher holds unwarranted, eccentric views about what subjects are. And they may reasonably add, they may say, if you're really on the lookout for something that philosophical standpoint that genuinely wipes away the horizon of personhood or subjectivity in the way that Ricoeur seems to feel Freud does, then you should look to not Freud, but Spinoza or Schopenhauer, or to get something of the same upshot without the metaphysical outlay, to contemporary eliminative materialism or many other aggressive forms of hard naturalism. And so it may be suggested, and Brian Leiter isn't here, but I think this is the kind of thing, it's not something that I think he's explicitly said, but it's the sort of thing that I think he would say or agree with, that there's a kind of confusion in the continental Freud reception. The sort of reaction elicited in Ricoeur and other philosophers by psychoanalytic theory is due to the fact that their philosophical background is so dominated by classical German philosophy, hermeneutics, phenomenology, and has failed to confront them squarely with naturalism. They've never taken it seriously, as it were, as a philosophical position. And this has led them to misidentify the source of their consternation with the idea of the unconscious and their excitement about Freud. What really shocks them, what really has the effect of a kind of Copernican revolution for them, is not the ideas in Freud that are distinctively and specifically psychoanalytic, but the naturalism that Freud binds them up with. So Freud may indeed be responsible for making naturalism seem a real, interesting philosophical possibility, because Freudian explanations have that ambitious scope and they have this importance for the human sciences that other naturalistic psychologies, it may be thought, don't have. But the naturalism in Freud is not what is distinctive of Freud. Analytic philosophers, by contrast, for whom naturalism comes with mother's milk, to use a phrase of Peirce's, have acquired immunity and are therefore able to take a more accurate view, separating the naturalistic wrappings of Freud's theories from psychoanalytic ideas as such. Or so it may be proposed, and I'm sort of imputing that view to Brian Leiter. Okay, so just to comment now on the point just reached and the opposition I've just described. Depending on your philosophical dispositions, you may have a gut feeling either one way or the other, but it seems to be plausibly both sides are in different ways unsatisfying. Certainly the statements I took from Ricoeur, at least isolated, appear hyperbolic, but equally exaggerated in the opposite direction is the Anglophone analytic indifference to the metaphysical dimension, if that's what we call it, of psychoanalysis. So we should ask, can it really be true that the almost universal perception of Freud's ideas as philosophically radical and the extraordinary influence which psychoanalysis has had in consequence, can it really be that all of that is a mistake? So if some philosophical tradition tells us that psychoanalysis modifies the empirical detail of our self-image but doesn't really bear on its essential structure, then plausibly there's something wrong with where it's drawing the line between philosophy and non-philosophy. Maybe its conception of the agenda is a conception of the agenda of philosophy is unduly contracted. And so one can imagine the diagnosis, which I offered a moment ago, being reversed. It could be argued, seems equally possible, that it's precisely because analytic Anglophone philosophers are so inured and desensitized to naturalism that they're unable to see what's at stake. So one can, I think, imagine someone from Ricoeur's side of the fence arguing that philosophers like Wollheim and Lear, they fail to see psychoanalysis for what it is, precisely because their philosophical sensibilities are insufficiently informed by Descartes, Kant, post-Kantianism. Just to note here, the issue that I referred to earlier concerning the relation of philosophy to natural consciousness resurfaces here, and it will, I think, in the end make a very big difference to how one thinks about the impact of psychoanalysis. So the analytic philosopher who regards Ricoeur as, so to speak, mistaking Freud for Spinoza assumes, of course, that natural consciousness is roughly aligned with naturalism, or will be when it's purged of Christian and post-Christian myths. And the same assumption is made regarding Kantian commitments by Ricoeur and other continental philosophers who regard the analytic Anglophone response to Freud as, so to speak, complacent. So, with the territory set out and the issues unpicked a bit, let me now discuss in turn the two possibilities which I outlined at the outset, that firstly psychoanalysis contradicts natural consciousness, and secondly that it contradicts philosophical assumptions. So, first question, does psychoanalysis contradict natural consciousness? Does psychoanalysis as a new and distinctive form of psychological explanation show that our ordinary psychological picture of ourselves is in some important way defective? And of course, everything, or a very great deal, hangs on what counts as an important way. But let me just set out what I think is an argument, a train of thought that would lead one to think that the answer to that question is really no. So the line of thought will go like this. If psychoanalysis subverts or unsettles natural consciousness, then it needs to at some point correct ordinary psychology, which on the face of it ought to mean that it leads you and me, folk psychologists, to withdraw psychological ascriptions that are warranted by usual lights. So the thought is, if psychoanalysis adds to, but it never subtracts from, all of the ascriptions of ordinary psychology, then, rather like cognitive psychology on most understandings, it leaves ordinary folk psychology unscathed. But there are two things wrong with the idea that psychoanalysis corrects ordinary psychology, and the first is just simply a logical problem. If psychoanalysis employs the same kind of criteria and rules of inference as ordinary psychology, then when it corrects ordinary psychology, this can just as well be described as ordinary psychology correcting itself. And if psychoanalysis is, on the other hand, employing different rules and criteria, then it's hard to see how it can show that ordinary psychology gets things wrong. The analogy, if you pick up the ball playing rugby, then you've done something wrong by the rules of soccer, but not by the rules of rugby. Secondly, and I think more importantly and more interestingly, I think it is false that psychoanalytic explanations overturn those of ordinary psychology. Now, this is something that can really only be thrashed out with reference to a concrete case history, and there isn't time to exposit one here. So here, substituting for the case history a diagram with a roughly familiar Oedipal shape to it. Let me just talk through it in a way that I think you'll get the idea. So the rat man thinks that he loves his father. Freud says that he hates his father. So does he not love his father? No, he does love his father and he hates his father. Can he both love and hate his father? If he hates his father, doesn't that interfere with his love? Well, it does in a certain sense. And the logic of ambivalence is very tricky, and if your boyfriend, girlfriend, spouse says that they love you and then they add, but I also hate your guts and wish to see you dead, you're not going to feel reassured. But that isn't the situation here, clearly. The rat man is conscious of his father in a benevolent light, and the father whom he hates, or the father that he feels is full of murderous rage, the father that he fantasizes, the father that he rediscovers in his encounters with his military superior, his commanding officer, the captain, and so on. This is a father who shows up in restricted contexts. It's an imaginary construction, and it has none of the properties. This man, the hated father, has none of the properties of the man who brought him up. In fact, the rat man's father, the one he loves, the real one, is in fact deceased. The one he hates is the one who is still alive, which is what makes it possible for the rat man to want to wish him dead. So, the ascription of the rat man's self-ascription of love for his father isn't undermined by Freud's ascription of father hatred to the rat man. And I think if you switch from emotion to belief, you get the same result. The rat man believes his father to be a deeply benevolent man who cared for him, wished the best for him. Freud says that he believes that his father is full of murderous rage. Question, can he believe the first if he believes the second? Well, clearly not if the two beliefs stand on a single level, but they don't. Each has a different type of content and manifests itself in quite different ways. Do the two beliefs conflict? Well, of course, but not in the way that beliefs grounded in evidence conflict, and not in a way that can ever present itself to the rat man as an occasion for making up his mind. The rat man is never going to have to think, what do I really believe about my father? By the time the rat man comes to accept that he has the father-directed beliefs, if we call them that Freud brings to light, that he pictures his father as aggressive and murderous and so on, by that time he's also acquired from the analysis enough new conceptual sophistication to understand that the two beliefs have quite different locations. One belief is here, the other belief is, as it were, down there. And any question which might present itself to the rat man concerning his father's moral character, he knows that that issue, that's not what is at issue in the understanding of his neurosis, his psychological situation. Now, the other thing, just to note here, if I have time, I'll come back to it. The rat man's father love and father hate, and the corresponding pair of beliefs about his father, if they are beliefs, are not merely separated out by Freud, but also interpreted as bound up with one another, adding a further layer of complexity. The rat man keeps his father alive, on Freud's account, not simply because he loves him, doesn't want him to have died, but also because he needs him to be alive, on Freud's account, in order for him not to have been destroyed by the rat man's own murderous, aggressive wishes. The rat man needs proof that his father has resisted the aggressive attacks which he's showered on him. So the various psychological, what we have here is a psychological composite of a very strange, self-maintaining, self-fueling kind. But once again, at least this is what I would wish to claim, that although, of course, all of this is psychological news to the rat man and to us, it supplements rather than corrects the self-understanding that the rat man had before he entered his analysis. Now, I don't want to take up, I don't know how I'm doing with time, I don't want to take up too much time on this, but certainly one suggestion that one might make, and this would be consistent with the way that Brian Leiter again pursues Freud in his Hermeneutics of Suspicion paper, you might say, well, okay, this isn't, at this point, psychoanalysis isn't revealed to have impact, but when we switch to consideration of drive, sexuality, account of morality, all of that stuff, there we see that psychoanalysis undermines what we ordinarily think. I'm not going to go into that really, just say two things about the morality stuff, well, in a way continuous with things that Michael Voss was saying this afternoon. I don't see the psychoanalytic account of the underpinnings of moral consciousness as impugning them. And with regard to sexuality, the important point, I think, is, or the point I would try and emphasize, is that what Freud means by sexuality, contra the perhaps cartoon pansexualist position, portrait of Freud as the kind of sex-crazed maniac, what Freud understands by sexuality is something very, very different from what we ordinarily understand. It's not sexual desire in the sense of something that we could avow, act on, want to see realized. And a place to look for a good account of what sexuality means for Freud, in addition to his 3 essays, is, oddly enough, the chapter in Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception called something like The Body in Its Sexual Being. And Merleau-Ponty, I think, presents nicely what sexuality amounts to for Freud. So, consideration of this individual case history, I've generalized from it, and I think my claim has been that psychoanalytic interpretation of cultural things, art, morality, and so on, I think one comes or should come to the same conclusion, namely that psychoanalytic explanations are or ascriptions are of a fundamentally different kind from, and consequently on a different level from, those of ordinary psychology. And of course, that's easily said, and it's not philosophically the end of the story. Having drawn the distinction, said that these are of different kinds, they operate at different levels, something then has to be said about what positively constitutes the difference and about how propositional attitudes interact with unconscious content, all of that stuff. So there's a big story to be told, of course. The point I'm just hammering away at is that psychoanalytic explanations cannot reasonably, properly be mistaken for those of ordinary psychology, and psychoanalytic explanations take as given, by and large, almost without exception, the results of ordinary psychology, and then extend them further, try and explain the things that ordinary psychology has trouble with, all of the rat man's obsessive symptoms and so on. So that was consideration of the idea that psychoanalysis impacts on natural consciousness. So now to turn to the other side, does psychoanalysis have necessary revisionary implications for philosophical views? Now here, the natural thing to do would be to turn to Freud's texts, the metapsychological writings, but instead I said I want to try and give a reconstruction. And what I'm doing here follows very closely a paper which I recommend very, very strongly by Richard Wollheim called The Mind and the Mind's Image of Itself, and it's published in one of his collections of essays called On Art and the Mind, or I think you can probably get it electronically from the International Journal of Psychoanalysis for 1969. So not everything that I say will be stuff that Richard Wollheim has said, but I'm, as it were, following in his tracks. So the question that seems to me interesting, and really challenging question, is on what basis, by what means, could I, in the first person, get to think that my mind looks something like that? How could I be led from the first person, or at least without adopting a third person perspective which is incongruent with alienates me from the first person perspective, how could I be led to accept that my mind has that kind of shape? Now, the first thing I think to say is that, well, if you accept that that's the right or the more interesting or challenging way of posing the question, then we should not put too much weight on this way that Freud has of justifying the assumption of the unconscious. So I won't read through it, but this is a statement from his 1915 paper. Freud is trying to explain why we should think ab initio that there is any such thing, and he says, well, just the last part, all the acts and manifestations which I notice myself do not know how to link up with the rest of my mental life must be judged as if they belonged to someone else. They are to be explained by a mental life ascribed to this other person. Well, that I think should be taken as a kind of heuristic, and it shouldn't be taken as, we shouldn't think that this commits Freud to modeling the unconscious on a second mind. If we do that, then we've bought into the idea that one person, or what seemed to be one person, is in fact a multiplicity of persons or selves, centers of agency. And although admittedly that might be the right way to think about Freud, and it's certainly the way that some people do think Freudian ideas should be represented, that seems to me expensive and unattractive, because all of the primary data, everything that kind of gets the ball rolling in psychoanalysis, is based on the assumption that we're dealing with one thing. The rat man is one person in conflict, in tension with himself. So this reflexive dimension, I think, is key to the whole motivation of psychoanalysis, and we lose sight of it if we switch from first to third person. So, question, how proceeding from the first person could one possibly come to think that one has an unconscious? Well, I'm going to try and again, avoid taking too much time, but sort of track the route or a route. And from taking as a starting point what may seem a unpromising or unnatural starting point, this is passages from Wittgenstein Philosophical Investigations, and as we all know, Wittgenstein is generally thought in the investigations to be undermining, amongst other things, the Cartesian conception of the mind, or the bubble picture, some people sometimes call it. Now, that may well be true, but his attack incorporates, as these fascinating passages show, I think, very clear acknowledgement of what must be the root of this conception of the mind as something that is an inside of itself, and that is something intrinsic to the phenomenology of thinking. So, the passages, when we speak or write with thought, I mean, as we normally do, we wouldn't by and large say that we think more quickly than we talk. Rather, the thought seems not to be detached from the expression. On the other hand, however, one does speak of the speed of thought, of how a thought goes through one's head like lightning, of how problems become clear to us at a stroke, and so on. So it's natural to ask whether the same thing happens in lightning-like thought as in speech that is not thoughtless, only extremely accelerated. So that in the first case, the clockwork, as it were, runs down all at once, and the second, bit by bit, braked by the words. I can see or understand a thought complete before my mind's eye in a flash, in the same sense in which I can make a note of it in a few words or a few pencil dashes. And then he raises the question, what makes this note into a Zusammenfassung of this thought? Well, these passages obviously raise all sorts of questions, but putting aside altogether the question of where Wittgenstein wants to go with this, what is interesting and important for present purposes is just Wittgenstein's discrimination between two things, that there is on the one hand the thoughts coming complete before the mind's eye in a flash, so that's as it were the flash of lightning of the thought, and then on the other hand there is the thought itself, that which is flashed, and this relation Wittgenstein likens to that of the note made or the pencil dashes to the thought which it epitomizes. So Wittgenstein may well be, and this would be the standard interpretation, I guess, casting suspicion on the whole idea of a flash of thought as a private item. It's one of those cogs that turns wheels and so on. That may be true, but he's also pointed to the fact that thinking as we know it of itself suggests a rudimentary, indeterminate distinction of here and there, of inner and outer, which is not the distinction between mind and world that we have in sense perception. Rather, it's a distinction within the mind. The flash is what appears here, present to me in consciousness, and it comes to or into consciousness, certainly from me, but from, well, out there, from, as it were, my beliefs. So, as Wittgenstein says, the thought is not to be detached from its expression, the relation is internal, but nevertheless there is a movement taking place whereby the thought comes to expression. It's laboring the point, there's a relation of what is thought, the proposition that I can equally well say out loud or write down or simply think, there's a relation of that to the realization or manifestation of it, the thinking of it. That is, whatever it is that can be either exhibited in a flash or extended over the course of writing a sentence. Now, again, Wittgenstein may well be warning us off inflating this distinction into the bubble, stream of consciousness, Jamesian, Cartesian picture. But what matters is just this really interesting, to my mind, internal articulation of an inside-outside distinction, which is part and parcel of what it is to take oneself to be a thinker. So it has a kind of transcendental status. Well, this relation that Wittgenstein is describing, we know can assume defective forms in which the manifestation is imperfect. So what we say can fail to give voice to what we mean. Our thoughts, as we try and formulate them, can all too familiarly fail to be clear, and so on. And the fact that imperfection is possible shows that the relation of manifestation is capable of variability in respect of its, as it were, tightness or the proximity of its terms. Sometimes it takes me some time to bring to mind that face, that name, that telephone number. The distance, as it were, that the thought, that which is flash, needs to travel to manifest itself is variable. Now, clearly, this is the kind of relation that I've been describing here. This relation is obviously involved in other kinds of mental states. And the type of mental state of interest for present purposes is, of course, the emotions, because here we have, ordinary language gives us two distinct terms or concepts for picking out each of the items. There is, on the one hand, my passion, my hatred for Pierre or love for Juliette, or whatever it is. And then there is the feeling, or the episode of feeling. And the relation of manifestation here, feeling to emotions, clearly there's a lot more slack between that than there is in general between thinking and believing. I'm wrong about my emotions a lot more than I'm wrong about my beliefs. But it's essentially the same kind of relation. And this paragraph, too long to read out, from South gives an idea of the different ways in which this relationship can be considered. Now, trying to move back a bit to psychoanalysis. So we've got the idea of a kind of internal, asymmetric, one-many relation of manifestation. The same emotion, same belief can manifest itself in various different episodes of thinking or feeling. And if this relationship can express itself in both emotion, affect, and in thought, then the fundamental nature of the relation can't be essentially defined in terms of either. It's not, as it were, an exclusive property of thinking or of emotion. It must be something deeply structural. And we're also, I said, very familiar with the idea that this relationship can be disturbed. If I'm distracted, it will take me longer. As I get older, it takes me longer to recall names and so on. So all sorts of contingencies can interfere with the relation of manifestation. And we are also familiar with, be it noted, cases of outright dissociation. So cases where I think something and perhaps reflect, or somebody points out, that's not something I really believe. The thought, the thinking was, as it were, the feigning of a belief. Or other cases where I have a feeling feels hollow, or I have a feeling, I'm not quite sure what it is. What does it indicate? What is this feeling? What is it? The Unheimlich, or what is it that's kind of going on in me? What am I thinking about the object that gives me this feeling? Just as, conversely, there are feelings which fail to materialize. So I meet you at the station, we've not seen each other for a month. I'm expecting to feel joy, I feel nothing. It's kind of a case that Sartre relishes. So we have cases where the one thing exists without the other. So all of this puts us in a position to formulate at least the conceptual possibility that the link between the manifestation in consciousness, the thing present to us, and the mental state itself could be severed altogether. I'm saying that's a coherent, thinkable possibility on the basis of what we've had. And then the next question is quite simply, well, if this is a conceptual possibility, is there anything to motivate it? I mean, rather, is there anything to make me think that it's actually instantiated in the world? And here it can no longer be an armchair matter. We put it to the test. And here we, in a way, go back to that passage from Freud, and we ask, well, is there anything in my mental life that gives me reason for thinking that there are things that are in my mind but don't manifest themselves, or don't manifest themselves directly? And this being an a posteriori matter, it's now over to you to reflect on your mental life, see how much of it you are prepared to write off as chance or the arbitrary play of neurons or whatever, and how much of it you think requires an explanation. Now, sorry, I think it's jumping the gun. Sorry. This line of thought that I've tried to rehearse very, very quickly has clearly taken us quite a long way, but it shouldn't be pretended that we've yet arrived at Freudian metapsychology. And there are two things missing here. To be precise, people have different views about what is strictly Freudian, what is post-Freudian, what is essential to Freud's theories, and what isn't. All will agree, I think, that one thing which is essential to Freud is the idea that the relation of manifestation that I've talked about can assume a kind of structural complexity such that Freud wants to be able to say that if I forget my umbrella or can't remember a name, have a dream, I make a joke, Freud wants to say that there is a thought that I'm having, it may be a desirous thought, some kind of affective thought, but there's something I'm thinking which is manifest in the joke or the failure of memory, slip of the tongue, whatever it might be. And this thing that is manifest is not manifested as it would appear if I were thinking it in lucid reflection or in emotional clarity. So we've got the idea that the relation of manifestation can assume an indirect, oblique, symbolic form. Now, what's the evidence for this, or what's the case for this? And certainly a case has to be argued. Well, I'm not going to go into it here, but here the key texts are very obviously the interpretation of dreams and psychopathology of everyday life. And there Freud wants to argue that the relationship of interpretation that we have in external contexts, when we're trying to make sense of texts and utterances that don't make sense to us and so on, that kind of relation can be imported into the mind so that we can see manifest mental items as symbolic or coded or oblique expressions of underlying states. So clearly, all will agree that that addition is needed for psychoanalysis to take wing. The other thing which I think is also needed, although again people will disagree, is the conception, is what Wollheim calls the calls the corporealization, so that would be Verkörperung or something, of mental items. And the idea here is that Freud exposes the fact, or stumbles across, reveals the fact, that some of the mental states that are of high interest to psychoanalysis, which fail to manifest themselves in ordinary mental life and only show themselves in oblique or symbolic or indirect form, some of these involve mental states representing themselves as having spatial or corporeal properties. So the idea here is that bits of your mind, thoughts that you don't want to have, affects that you don't want to feel, memories that you don't want to recall, and so on, and things, as it were, bubbling up from the id, that these take a shape in the mind, and they exist for the mind experientially as objects of something like, some kind of equivalent of bodily experience. And this, if you buy into this story, there's a very great deal that you can do with it. You can go back to Freud's original idea of repression, Verdrängen, whatever it is, the pushing down. What is it that distinguishes repression in the interesting psychoanalytic sense from mere suppression, as when I just don't want to think about the Brexit, whatever it might be? Something more is involved. What is the more? Well, on this account, there is something like a pushing away of the thought, which is represented in a quasi-corporeal mode. And if you follow this through in the history of psychoanalytic theory, you get to ideas in Melanie Klein, Wilfried Bion, this language that probably familiar with, of the idea of the mind performs acts of internalization, identification, projection, projective identification, this idea of the mind as a container which finds some thoughts intolerable and tries to expel them, takes other thoughts and objects inside itself. So if we now, with all of that, return to the Rat Man, and here again it would be necessary to go into the case history and into the Rat Man's very, very strange anal sexual fantasies, you'll be able to say that the ticking over of the Rat Man's mental life involves treating objects, his father as murderous and so on, as if they were physical things that he can push away, destroy, things that, as it were, rebound on him, threaten to annihilate him, and so on. Okay, so I think I've probably got only 10 minutes more. So let me come back to the original question and try and say something about it. I mean, the original question was, to what extent is Ricard right, or to what extent is it true that psychoanalysis subverts or contradicts things that we ordinarily believe about ourselves, or our natural Cartesian, Kantian self-image? Well, what I've tried to offer is a reconstruction which starts right on the inside of reflective self-consciousness, tells us that the mind has an idea of itself as having an inside and an outside, and then elaborates that by noting that on the basis of perfectly ordinary psychological knowledge, to the effect that not all emotions manifest themselves accurately in feeling and so on, the idea that the relationship can be slackened, and then I introduced the symbolization hypothesis, and then Volheim's corporealization hypothesis. So it's a more or less straight route. I'm not saying that it's not open to challenge, obviously, but it's roughly continuous from ordinary psychology to something which, once again, is psychologically news. It's not something we knew beforehand, but it doesn't seem to controvert what we ordinarily think. At least not in the narrow sense that I started out with. That is, it doesn't show that we were wrong to think of ourselves as having these desires, these beliefs, these intentions. Now, what does Ricard think about this? Because I've used him somewhat as a kind of Aunt Sally, I suppose, or as a sort of target. Well, when Ricard is trying to explain the impact of psychoanalysis, he very naturally cites Fichte, and he refers to Fichte's idea that the I is by its nature something self-producing, and that if you're going to be an I, you've got to take yourself as something that is self-produced, not as something produced by something else. Now, interestingly, and of course if that's right, then if that were true, that our self-conception involves this very strong commitment to self-production, then very clearly psychoanalysis overturns it in just the way that Ricard goes on to claim. But it's worth noting, and just to get a sort of sense of the complexity of the issue, and this really does seem to me a very difficult point to decide, and I'm just going to leave it hanging. It's worth noting that Fichte himself interrupted trains of thought. So the point is, Ricard appeals to Fichte, trying to show that we have an intuition which Fichte expresses about the nature of selfhood or I-hood, which is plainly contradicted by psychoanalysis. And the point I was making was just that, yeah, of course, if it is true that we conceive ourselves in this very narrow Fichtean way, then psychoanalysis overturns everything. But the point I was just going to make was that, very interestingly, Fichte himself, so this comes from the System of Ethics, Fichte himself is perfectly happy with the idea that we, in addition to existing as I's, self-positing, self-positing as self-positing entities, that we also exist as drive, as Trieb, and as part of nature. So, right, there is therefore an original determinate system of drives and feelings called nature. This system of drives and feelings is to be thought of as nature, nature in question is to be thought of as our nature. I myself am, in a certain respect, nature, notwithstanding the absolute character of my reason, my freedom. And this nature of mine is a Trieb. Not only do I posit myself as nature, I also assume blah, 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 and so on. So, the relevance of this is just this allows us to put the question, well, if even, as it were, the Fichtean I can accommodate the idea that it exists as drive in nature and even explicable in natural terms, then why shouldn't Freud's id or UCS, the unconscious, or the Kleinian inner world, whatever version you like, why shouldn't that also be regarded as a natural realization or embodiment of me? I mean, what's the problem there? Well, this is, as I said, this is something I want to just leave hanging or leave for discussion, and it's something that I change my mind about fairly frequently. Sartre's view is that this really just doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because the properties that the id or the UCS or the S has, they're just too alien to the properties that the I has as a subject of free self-determination. They're heterogeneous. They're not of the same kind. I can't turn my id into ish. That can't be done on Freud's own account. So Sartre arrives at this dramatic conclusion. Freud has cut the psychic whole into two. I am the ego and I am not the id. And Sartre will argue that this isn't a result that can be allowed to stand. It's paradoxical. It shows us that psychoanalysis is fundamentally ill-conceived. So that was just considering one way in which you might think, I've left that undecided, that psychoanalysis has the kind of impact that Ricard says it has. The two other ways. Now, this picture that I've drawn out of Freud and Klein and that Wollheim spends on, this idea that the mind on its inside constructs this inner world, this idea that the mind projects into itself a kind of fictional reality which it experiences as real. So the mind on the inside experiences its internal objects as if they were external, and that this internal fiction, as it were, projects itself onto the world at large, so that in the Ratman case, the terror that he feels when he confronts his captain in real life, all of the anxiety, that's a confrontation with an internal object, but the internal object has been located out there in this other authority figure. This idea that our lives, or at least our intersubjective reality, is kind of riddled with this fictional dimension, that intersubjective reality is populated by these kind of weird internal entities. That doesn't, once again, strictly show that ordinary psychology is getting things wrong, but it's an extreme thought. It's an extreme thought and extremely unsettling. And in a way, I think it is more unsettling than the recognition that your beliefs and values are a function of your social position or economic forces. Okay, so leaving that. The last respect in which I wanted to suggest psychoanalysis has shock value. In the picture that I gave of the Ratman, I didn't try and explain it properly, but I think you probably have got the impression that it's confusing. And the questions you might reasonably raise after finishing reading Freud's Ratman case history. You might ask, well, hold on, at the end of the day, what is the problem with the Ratman? So he loves and he hates his father. These two emotions or motives fuel one another. He seems to love in order to hate. He seems to hate in order to love. Now, how can one person accommodate both of those psychological elements, and how can they function together in that way? Suppose his love originated in the usual way. Children begin to love their parents. And suppose his hatred originated in the usual way. He was cross with his father because his father denied him this or that, or blamed him for this or that. We still have the question, how did the love and hate come together? How did they come to be confounded in the particular way that we find them, that we discover them to be in the Ratman? Now, it seems to me that in the case of the Ratman, although Freud tries really hard to press on it the standard Oedipal interpretation, according to which it all arises out of his father's denial of his sexual wishes towards his mother, Freud's interpretation, the Oedipal interpretation, really doesn't convince. And here I can't speak with any authority because I'm not an analyst, but I think that reading, we've now got 100 years or more of case histories, I think the evidence is out there that there just is no truth of the matter at the end of the day in psychoanalytic explanation. It seems to me psychoanalytic explanations reach a point where they fizzle out. And there are many things that one could point to here. Freud's late theories, all of that stuff about repetition compulsion, all of the weird stuff about the eros and thanatos, all of that is plausibly seen as a kind of response to bewilderment, that psychological truth, psychological explanation isn't clearer. So the story, it's rather as if Freud started with the seduction theory, where you have a kind of detective novel, you know what the crime is, and then you work out who did it, and it's all solved. And as Freud, his clinical practice and his ideas get more and more complicated and sophisticated, it becomes increasingly less clear to him what the ultimate causes or grounds of human motivation are. And so he introduces things like the eros thanatos. And the Wolfman case is, if one is looking just at Freud's own case histories, is often taken as an example of something that just ends very badly. The Wolfman himself seems to have been perfectly happy with it, but it just doesn't make sense, what Freud tries to discover. So I'm suggesting that psychoanalytic case histories, they have something of the character of detective stories in which the furthest you can get is working out what the crime is. What is the crime that's been committed? And what you don't get, what isn't delivered at the end of the day, is knowledge of who the perpetrator is or what their motives were. This certainly isn't a conceptual matter, and from a purely conceptual point of view, it could, of course, have turned out quite differently. It could have turned out that it could conceptually, it's possible. You can imagine a world in which everything is explained either in terms of the seduction theory or simple Oedipal dynamics. But the discovery, I think, that this isn't the case and that there is this kind of limit to the degree to which you can rationalize the sources of human motivation. This, I think, this is a further respect and a very distinctive respect in which psychoanalysis shows something that is repugnant to ordinary self-understanding, insofar as each of us, I think, naturally takes ourselves to be something that can be represented as a practical syllogism. My life ought to have the shape of a practical syllogism with a major premise stating what it is that I want to get out of it. And optimally, the life itself would be the conclusion. If our lives can't be, if our psychological existence can't be restructured in a transparent teleological shape, that is very, very strange news. And that may be what Nietzsche had in mind when he talked about our being, at the end of the day, strangers to ourselves. And finally, if I can get it, a picture. So this goes back to the stuff I was talking about the inner world. This, I think it's Kirchner, it's a German expressionist picture, first decade of the 20th century. This, I think, is roughly what an inner world looks like. Now, I'm not saying mine looks quite like that, but that is something like the mental horizon, the unconscious mental horizon that Freud exposes in The Rat Man. And the discovery that you have those figures, that there are these images, that they exert this power over you, that I think shows that there is something fundamentally right about Ricard's claim that psychoanalysis turns everything upside down, although not, as I've indicated, for exactly the reasons that Ricard brings forward. Okay, thank you.